So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, those of you who are different places around the world. We're hoping that this recording is going to go okay, but today there's various earthquakes taking place around us in Iceland. So if you see things swaying from side to side, then you have some sort of idea of what exactly is going on here. It's what makes life a little bit more exciting here. Anyway, what do we mean by belief? Now, for a number of years, up until comparatively recently, travellers to Iceland on Icelandair would regularly be greeted by a statement on a screen in front of them that stated that one of the most amazing things about Iceland is that 50% of the population believes in elves. Now, one can imagine the images that would have appeared in the minds of these tourists who might have landed expecting to find a whole pile of Icelanders gathering around rocks every Friday night to dance with a bunch of minuscule, pointy-eared, winged beings. Now, much as I've tried to correct this statement, it does live on, and in addition to helping to finance Reykjavik's particularly fascinating elf school, has led to foreign journalists annually seeking me out to find out more about what's going on with the Icelanders. It's become something along with the arrival of wasps that reminds me that summer is coming. Now, as I commonly say to the journalists in question in the interviews that follow, their quest for so-called elves actually says more about them than it does about the apparent uniqueness of Iceland. In a sense, what we have here is a reflection of Fox Mulder's poster that adorned the wall of his underground X-Files office at the headquarters of the FBI. I want to believe. It's a wonderful statement, and I think it echoes well exactly why these journalists keep hounding me. The wonder of the elvish was something that they grew up with, being enchanted by, and the stories told them by their parents, and they feel that it's become lost in their countries. Now, while some may see this image of 50% of Icelanders hanging out with the elves as being somewhat amusing, others feel that visiting Iceland has reopened closed doors, given them a chance to reclaim that fairy tale world that they knew in their childhood. This, of course, is a dream that we can witness in the enduring popularity of the Lord of the Rings films, Game of Thrones, the various Viking-related series, as well as these seemingly endless stream of gothic zombie movies. Now, I have the questionable responsibility of having to break down these preconceptions. In addition to informing these journalists that the Icelandic álfar certainly are not elves, and that the figures that they've heard are highly misleading, I also feel the need to remind them that when it comes down to it, these Icelanders are actually not so different to them. Yes, Icelanders believe in this and that, but then so too do they, with their fears of troll-like serial killers, terrorists and paedophiles that they feel the daily need to protect their children from. And yes, of course, such figures exist, just as regular threats of getting lost in the mountains or falling into rivers or lakes existed for the Icelanders of the past. But do these figures really exist in the numbers that people imagine on the basis of the folk legends that they regularly watch on television screens? Everyone believes, and indeed, as I underlined to these journalists, questions of belief are not relegated to the supernatural. Indeed, when it comes down to it, much of what we think we know is actually a matter of belief. Something that ranges from the history that we pick up at school to our supposed knowledge about the solar system or the news that we listen to or read. And here, all that one needs to do is to read George Orwell's 1984, a book that I think should be essential reading in all schools, and especially in our present climate, where the walls between truth and fiction are regularly being dismantled by populist politicians and media moguls. And as Orwell shows, truth is something that can change by the moment. 2 and 2 can make 5. But let's step back for a moment and consider the question of what exactly we mean when we talk about belief. It's, of course, something that's been discussed in numerous articles, and especially in connection with what we in the BNN refer to as belief narratives. Now, as you can see here, the Oxford definition talks about belief being trust or confidence in, acceptance in any received theology, acceptance of a fact, a thing or statement as true or existing, while the verb believe is said to mean to have faith in, to put trust in the truth of a statement, efficacy or of a principle or system, advisability of a practice, existence of a thing. Webster's, on the other hand, states that belief is essentially assent to anything proposed or declared, and its acceptance as fact by reason of the authority whence it proceeds, apart from personal knowledge, faith, the whole body of tenets held by professors of any faith, a creed, a conviction. The verb belief, meanwhile, is said to mean to place credence in and accept as true upon the ground of authority, testimony, or logical inference, apart from personal knowledge. Place confidence in, expect or hope, have faith, to be more or less firmly persuaded of the truth of anything, think or suppose. And one can see similar understandings in these other definitions proposed by, for example, Michel de Certeau, Marilyn Mott's, Ulo Valk, for example. But certain key features do stand out in these dictionary definitions, and not least words like trust and acceptance in the Oxford definition, and assent, acceptance, and persuasion in the case of Webster's, which also refers to external authorities, and not least to the difference between belief and, as you heard before, personal knowledge. I'll come back to some of these terms later, but the elements of trust and acceptance are particularly important, not least because they underline that more than one party is involved. What's nonetheless clear here is that separating belief from knowledge is somewhat problematic. The Webster's definition hits the nail on the head when it talks about personal knowledge and experience having more credence than something that we've been informed by another person, like a priest or a university lecturer. And here the word authority used by Webster's is central, not least because it's bound up with the question of trust. And equally problematic is that those who believe something completely will rarely refer to it as being belief rather than knowledge, often because they connect it to personal experience. Now, as David Hufford put it, I know, what you know, you only believe. In short, when it comes down to it, can we objectively separate knowledge from belief? Should we perhaps give more credence to the official rather than the unofficial? Marilyn Mott argues that it might be better to regard belief as simply being a way of knowing. Both words are somewhat packed. As Benjamin Gatling recently put it, belief as a term encompasses a range of competing concepts, adding that if genres leak, so too do terms, and belief leaks more than others. As Ulo Valk and Marianne Bowman end up concluding, belief seems to be an elusive category. The problems of this kind have led some scholars to suggest that we should therefore avoid the whole question of belief entirely and keep to the practice of belief or believability. Now, with regard to the former, I would state immediately that we do not always practice our beliefs, as all of us know from experience. Fear of punishment or ridicule can always get in the way. Believability is more logical, since all beliefs are naturally contestable. For now, though, I'm going to keep to belief as some form of entity. To my mind, it's still a useful concept to use in spite of its breadth. Indeed, can you have believability without some level of belief? Now, let's start by going back to that statement about 50% of Icelanders believing in elves. The roots of this idea go back to a newspaper survey in the 1980s, which simply asked a number of Icelanders whether they believed in álfar or not. Now, such direct questions about belief are pretty pointless when it comes down to it. Belief isn't rarely that simple. What I tell these journalists to do, if they really want to find out about Icelandic attitudes to the álfar, is to pose the person that they're talking to with a hypothetical question. In short, imagine that you live in a house with a garden, and there is a rock in your garden which you are thinking of blowing up in order to allow yourself to make place for a hot pot or a jacuzzi. Imagine that the day before this grand demolition is about to take place, your neighbour casually looks over the fence and says, "What are you doing? You do know that that is an álfasteinn, an elf rock, don't you?" The question now is, do you go ahead and blow up the rock or not? From experience, I'd argue that a large majority of Icelanders would decide against it. Does this then mean that they're believers, or that they would rather avoid damaging something associated with national heritage? That all in all they quite fancy having an elf feature in their garden? Or simply that they are superstitious, believing that blowing up the rock might cause something to happen? It might nonetheless also have something to do with previous experiences that they've heard recounted by others, or a certain Nordic mindset which tends to approach good fortune with a certain wariness. This is, of course, Iceland, and as we've met today with these earthquakes, no one knows quite when the next volcano is going to block the airwaves. It was because of this range in possible answers that our national survey of folk belief, carried out in 2006 to 2007, in which I talked about at the ISFNR meeting way back in 2009, deliberately took a different approach. I was already getting a little bit tired of journalists, but since answering their questions was naturally part of my job, I wanted to at least give them more solid answers. Involving around about 1,000 participants of all ages and both sexes with differences in academic background and from both urban and rural settings, participants were asked about both belief and personal experience. Questions about belief having 5 possible answers which ranged in Icelandic from 100% rejection to 100% belief, in between coming unlikely, possible, probably. Those answering were also allowed to say that they had no opinion either way. Now, the survey itself was carried out in 2 sessions, one from 2006 involving a random selection of participants, and then another from 2007 which involved our students handing out and collecting answers from a similarly wide range of people to that in the random sample. So let's take a look at a few of the answers, starting, of course, with those ever-popular un-Elvish álfar. Now, as you can see here, the figures from both 2006 and 2007 were actually very similar, and largely also very similar to the answers of a previous survey carried out in 1974 with similar questions, which was sent out by the late parapsychologist Erlendur Haraldsson. The plan had been that we would be able to see how things had changed over time. Now, what becomes immediately clear when one looks at this particular slide is exactly how few people say that they either believe for certain or completely reject the possibility that álfar exist. Most, and that's around about 70%, are unsure. In short, they don't know and they're open to persuasion with evidence. And of course, in this particular case, as in many of the others, one might actually say that those who say that they certainly don't believe, they're actually also believers of a kind, since there is, when it comes down to it, no solid proof either way as yet. Both sides have what we might call a conviction. Everyone else has a differing degree of readiness to be persuaded either way. Indeed, as you can see here, only a very small number of people are ready to admit that they've actually encountered one of these beings in person. Now, the number of those who have had such experiences is reflected, as you can see in this slide here, with the blue section. The number of those who have had such experiences is roughly about, just as you see, 5% of those who answered the survey, about 50 people. Things are very, very different when we come to other kinds of belief in Iceland. Now, as you can see here, about 40% are pretty certain that telepathy exists, and around about a third senses that it's possible to see into the future. In terms of strength of belief, note the figures to the right, which are out of 5. And here, as you see in both cases, then 3.6, 3.3, 3.2. This was 2006, 2007. And note also the number of people in Iceland who say at the same time that they have a strong sense of omen before something nasty occurs. This was 2006, 2007. If only the Icelanders had followed this particular skill up before they ended up having a financial crisis just 1 year later in 2008. Now, other comparatively high figures can be seen with regard to the ability to see the dead, the ability to sense the dead, which is at the top here, and then the ability to dream about the future. Once again, note how many say that they are certain about these abilities, and how few say that these skills are totally out of the question. And now note how many, that's the blue figures, say that being aware of the presence of the dead is not merely a matter of belief, but something that's backed up by experience. In many cases here, people gave us brief stories that backed up these basic statements. And here we have the number of people who say that they have had the experience of dreams telling them about the future, something that's as old as the settlement of Iceland in the 9th century, if we look at the Icelandic sagas. And as you can see here, attitudes to life after death show a similar high level of positivity. Somewhat strange, though, seems to be the Icelandic sense of exactly where people go afterwards. Now, the European Values Survey of 2000 suggested that a majority of Icelanders are expected to go to heaven, even though they also had a comparatively high belief in the concept of sin. It will be certainly interesting to see more recent figures. Rumour has it that belief in the devil has grown since that financial crash. Now, if we move on now to a few other figures, as you can see here, there is a clear difference between attitudes relating to family ghosts, which according to legends are mainly associated with particular families, and then accompanying spirits that people are believed to be born with, both of which are referred to as fylgjur, or followers. Now, the figures in the latter are evidently very close to those dealing with the potential of getting contact with the dead and having prophetic dreams. Next slide shows figures dealing first of all with clairvoyancy and then about the existence of haunted houses, both of which again show the same degree of openness, erring towards the positive. As you can see here, with regard to experiences of haunted houses, once again, we do have a very large number of what I'm starting to refer to as potential legends. In other words, statements of belief which almost always tend to lead to the informant going on to tell a story supporting his or her belief. As you can see at the bottom here, a man answering this questionnaire has added a comment relating to a question about poltergeists, where he writes, "A friend of my wife's, me and my wife, saw an object that was in the middle of the kitchen table starting to move slowly towards my wife's friend. We weren't talking about spiritual things, and she had to catch the object." I would guess that in the case of haunted houses, we have around about 300 potential memorats that could be followed up. In the case of dreams and encounters with the dead, evidently a lot more. Next figures are interesting because they deal with two particularly Icelandic phenomena. The first relate to what I've come to call power points or enchanted spots on farms, so-called álagablettir, which no one is allowed to touch. Second group of figures below are connected with the idea of naming children after a person that appears in a dream to a pregnant woman, a phenomenon referred to as nafnavitjun in Icelandic. As you can see here, the figures for the latter are once again particularly high and are supported certainly whenever I've asked my students for examples of this. Belief in the former is somewhat lower, but one needs to remember that there is here a big difference between the countryside, where these places are found, and the city. Indeed, it's worth noting that a very high percentage of those legends recorded in the 1960s and preserved in the sound archive of the Arna Magnian Institute in Iceland deal with power points of this kind, and not least the dangers that can befall somebody who messes with such a site. But with regard to more modern attitudes, I might add that I recently suggested some teacher friends of mine that we should actually go and try this out and visit one of these sites with a spade to see what would happen. No one dared to take part. Now, this intrinsic wariness is certainly reflected in the next slide. As this shows, while stories about accidents that took place in relation to such sites abound, there are comparatively few examples of people having had personally bad experiences themselves. In other words, unlike those cases of dreams and encounters with the dead, we have very, very few memorats here. Oh, there's just another earthquake took place. This is not because of any lack of belief, but more because of the power of the traditional legends which are so regularly attached to these sites. Narratives which, as the archaeologist Atle Omland has noted, work more effectively than any official preservation order. Once again, though, are we talking about belief here, or rather some kind of wariness, or superstition that something might happen if a taboo is broken? Or are we once again dealing with a blend of superstition and belief, as with those so-called elf rocks? But this leads quite naturally on to a brief look at a few other figures which underline the fact that Icelanders are certainly not open to everything. They clearly have very little interest in the idea of reincarnation, and the same applies to any acceptance of the presence of Dobby the house elf, a folkloric figure that's never really caught on in Iceland but has always received a great deal more interest in the other Nordic countries and the North Atlantic islands in the shape of the Nisse, the Tomte and the Brownie. And with regard to something Tolk was talking about the other day, in spite of Hollywood and the X-Files, there is clearly comparatively little belief in the idea of UFOs in Iceland and very few stories of experience to back them up, as you can see here. It seems evident, in short, that Icelanders do not seem to do encounters with beings from other planets. Once again, though, considering the figures that I've just been talking about, in spite of the fact that I've been talking about a survey of popular beliefs, are we actually discussing belief here, or rather a lingering sense of uncertainty and an openness to either believe or reject? In other words, a sense of not knowing for certain and being open to persuasion. One notes that those answering here are people from our own times, not informants from the 19th century. Evidently, questions of belief are something that apply to those of us living in the present almost as much as they did to those living in the rural societies of the past and present. Arguably, what's going on in the case of the majority of those people in the survey who are clearly not certain, one way or another, is that they are facing a conflict in their heads with regard to different types of message that they've received over the course of their lives, especially if they've not had an experience relating to the phenomenon themselves. In other words, if they have no personal knowledge of the phenomenon in question, which is not uncommon, whether we're dealing with the supernatural or conspiracy theories. As the dictionary definitions noted at the start imply, this conflict centers around who you trust most. In other words, who you give most authority to. Is it your parents, your grandparents, your friends, your local society, your priest, your teacher, your government, your books, magazines, papers that you've read, programs you've seen, podcasts you've heard, the websites you've encountered, or the news you've just been handed by Facebook? Now, naturally, in the past, things were a little bit simpler. As with us, solid personal knowledge was essentially linked to daily experience, while explanations, other forms of information, were provided by the traditions passed on by family and by friends. In Iceland, often in the shape of the so-called kvöldvökur, or evening wakes, which formed a kind of traditional school. Here, people listened and learnt as traditional stories were told, sermons, Bible passages read, ballads shared. These were gatherings that were somewhat similar to the Ceilidh sessions known in Scotland and Ireland that Henry Glassey and Ray Cashman have so effectively described, although they involved somewhat less musical virtuosity. Now, it should be immediately clear from the content of these sessions, they involved a wide range of conflicts about the world, about the way in which the world should be understood, and especially those sensory experiences that people had encountered in a world that lacked electric light. On one side were the so-called traditional understandings that had been passed down in the local community in the form of oral narratives, and on the other, the information from outside that came in the form of writing or the weekly sermons from the priest. Local tradition talked about nature spirits, ghosts, outlaws, trolls, water horses, beach creeps, while the outside tradition questioned such beliefs and attempted to replace them with accounts of the devil, of holy ghosts, miraculous births, people being raised from the dead, and of water being transformed into wine. As visiting teachers began to join these spiritual advisors as authorities from outside, they brought with them another set of book-based narratives referring to evolution, the Big Bang, world history, and geography. Who are you supposed to trust most? How do you best interpret your personal experiences or those of others in this process which lies behind the memorat, which has been so effectively outlined by Lauri Honko? Many people today tend to look back at the people of rural societies in earlier centuries with a certain prejudice, imagining that they know so much better. You wait till you reach your 60s like me and find out that your youth is suddenly being portrayed on television in period dramas, that your grandchildren already see you as a caveman. Now, we are already outdated in their minds, and whatever, it's clear that the kind of conflicts introduced by the evening wake remain in our lives, even if they've changed in form, and arguably have become a great deal more complicated. There's little question that earlier statements of belief are being replaced and joined by others. Just to give one example, we now have respected quantum physicists like Richard Dawkins' good friend Lawrence Krauss, who inform us that the idea of innumerable invisible worlds existing alongside ours can now be mathematically proven. I might add that Lawrence Krauss has informed me, when I met him at one point, that there is no mathematical possibility that any of these worlds contains a god or any elves. In short, even in our world today, there is, of course, a great deal that we do not know for certain, but which we tend to trust as being correct. In other words, we can say that we are as surrounded by belief legends as our forefathers were, especially if we consider the definition suggested by Tim Tangolini, whereby a legend is a traditional, highly echo-typified, historicized narrative performed in a conversational mode, reflecting on a psychological level a symbolic representation of folk belief and collective experiences, and serving as a reaffirmation of commonly held values of the group to whose tradition it belongs. And as in the past, it needs to be remembered that these narratives, which try to persuade us to believe, don't only deal with a supernatural or quantum reality. Belief legends, past and present, also deal with historical figures, with plagues, with mass murderers, outlaws, lucky escapes. Just look at the number of conspiracy accounts floating around these days on the QAnon sites. Accounts like those that Tim was analysing just a few months back in the first of our Belief Narrative Network lectures. Just think too about our economies and how much they, when it comes down to it, are based very much on a strong degree of belief. What's value based on when it comes down to it? The key problem for our present world is what happens though when the trust that is so essential in holding the world together starts breaking down, and we no longer trust the outside sources that our education systems have convinced us are so trustworthy, as we no longer trust our newspapers and our television screens, no longer trust our leaders, our teachers, our so-called experts, something that's been recently actively encouraged by the British politician Michael Gove as part of the Brexit campaign in the UK, and of course by the ex-president of the USA, whose picture I'm not going to show here. Such arguments lead ultimately, though, to the collapse of the hierarchy of authority that's helped us to decide what we believe in our world of daily uncertainty, meaning that we end up trusting friends and social media more than any kind of scientific or researched fact. In short, we find ourselves being taken back several centuries to a world in which people trust friends and the oral traditions in the shape of social media more than they trust the so-called authorities. Now, is this such a bad thing? Well, it certainly is to my mind if it leads to murder and the collapse of law and order. And here I'd like to briefly give just one example of the dangers that can ensue in such a scenario, a case study that I've discussed in more detail in an article that's going to be coming out in Narrative Culture later this year. It deals with anxieties that have become associated with beliefs in a space where trust in external authorities has clearly broken down in the way that I've just been describing. The heart of the matter is an account told to me by our daughter, who was working in the countryside in northern Mozambique. She was working for an NGO there in 2017. She was part of a group gathering information for a report about the resilience of local village people with regard to potential natural catastrophes. The only white member of a party that was travelling in an old ambulance, she came directly into contact with recurring beliefs about a phenomenon known locally as chapasangwe, which means literally bloodsuckers or blood drinker. Now, to sum up the story quite briefly, she and her colleagues found the roads that they were travelling on repeatedly being blocked by people who were afraid that they were bloodsuckers. At one point, their car was rather violently searched by a mob. Elsewhere, other NGOs had had to barricade themselves inside buildings for safety. Some were badly beaten up. Other outsiders had been stoned to death. And in one place, a child was killed along with his grandmother simply because a mob had found a pump for an airbed inside his bag. As you can see here, things were not helped by the media, which passed on stories not only about the number of attacks, but also accounts, memorats, told by people of how their blood had been sucked in the night by various kinds of equipment placed outside their houses. Here, as you see, one woman tells how it was on a Sunday around about midnight when I was asleep. I saw the blanket moving and the blanket was full of blood in the morning. Another local account reads, it was 9 p.m. I was already asleep when I woke up sick and I saw my right arm full of blood. We don't sleep here. We're very afraid. As you can see here, the account is accompanied by a photograph of the informant underlining its veracity. Same applies to these next accounts, as the woman in the photograph states, this is not hearsay. I know my blood was sucked. I saw a light in the corner of my room. I failed to stand up from my bed and I felt something piercing my left arm. Another woman tells how she was sleeping next to her husband when she saw a light like fire, adding, I heard the door open. I felt something like a needle in my finger. Here we can see, of course, all of those signs of the rhetoric of truth so effectively described by Elliot Oring. Things were not helped by the way that accounts were turned into headlines in national papers with very little questioning. They were often accompanied by gory photographs like this one, which seemed to support the narratives. And while some experts attempted to allay the fears of the local people, politicians on the campaign trail, like the president of Malawi, where similar attacks on outsiders had been taking place, suggested that it was probably best to leave matters in the hands of local magicians, neither accepting nor denying the truth of the blood-sucking stories. Now, as I note in the article, scares of this kind are a regular occurrence not only in the countryside of Mozambique and Malawi, but also in many other African countries where they take different forms. The most recent examples have been connected to Ebola. Different in form to the kind of vampire story that we know in Europe, these accounts regularly underline the use of technology to steal blood. They appear to have roots in stories that were brought to East Africa from India around the time of the First World War, and these Indian stories have roots in even earlier stories that go back to the medieval period, all telling of outsiders stealing blood. And while many such stories are of course connected to the Jewish people, as many of you will know, others found in Iceland certainly suggest that Arab pirates had similar habits. Now, the history of these stories is interesting, but what I find most important here is the longevity of the accounts, which, as I say, are constantly recurring and regularly leading to violent attacks on people. Here we're most definitely looking at openness and wariness becoming hard belief, terror that kept people awake all night as they gathered outside their homes together, playing drums to prevent them from falling asleep. Quite understandably, beliefs of this kind have roots in misunderstandings relating to the collection of blood by foreign health workers, blood which is seen by local people as having a particular power and which they have observed being taken away to distant cities for analysis and never being returned. Numerous explanations are given in the media, of course, for how the blood is used, many of which suggest that the government is closely involved. One can understand why NGOs and health workers have been under threat. But here, as I say, we are dealing with real fear and not least clear distrust of outside authorities, which has led to greater trust being placed in local narratives and beliefs in bloodsuckers, which have become traditional. With the help of various other outside voices passed on by the media, these narratives have become so convincing that they have led to people taking action and taking lives. The key question is how one should deal with such beliefs that have such consequences. There are obvious parallels with the events of January the 6th in Washington and the anti-vax movement. And should we though just observe? Should we simply watch what's going on, or should we help to restore the balance of beliefs of this kind that are leading to people dying? Now, as I've been underlining again and again throughout this lecture, questions of belief are not something that is restricted to rural communities of the past and the present. They are still a central part of all of our worlds and all of our lives, although in most cases it is essentially a matter of trust rather than belief, certainly believability. And that's what happens when you're faced with the innumerable things that you have difficulty in being certain about in our world. As we've seen in other lectures, questions of this kind deal with AIDS, Ebola, COVID, whether we should accept vaccinations or not. They deal with how we understand the news that we receive each day, the information passed on to us by our priests, our teachers, and the more uncertainty that's introduced into our lives by the dismantling of what we once saw as being truth, the more power is gained by the counter-arguments. Now, I'm by no means questioning belief here. Like everyone else involved in folkloristics, beliefs of all kinds interest me and they demand respect until they start bringing about the collapse of law and order and attacks on innocent people who are doing nobody any harm. Naturally, though, here we are moving into questions of ethics and our role as teachers and scholars. There's little question, though, that beliefs can add wonder, enchantment, and history to a space. They turn it from a piece of geology into a space with mystique. They help us make sense of things, to give them order, and they can also give us a sense of identity, connection, not only to our forebears, but also to those living around us. According to the theologian Guðmundur Ingi Markusson, they've actually helped us to survive right from the Stone Age onwards. In most cases, however, as I've shown here, we are not dealing with beliefs as much as different degrees of openness to persuasion. And when it comes down to it, perhaps this middle space that was so apparent in our belief survey is the best when it comes down to the ways in which we deal with the world and others around us. I've got a motto that I regularly tell my students: never trust an academic, and least of all, trust me. And what I mean is that rather than blindly trusting everything I say, I would much rather that my students listen to the arguments and the evidence that I present and see if it makes sense. In short, I want them to think and to decide for themselves based on what they have in front of them with an open mind. I want them to then go out into this world that is still full of conflicting beliefs, firmly equipped with critical minds that enable them to listen to the various stories that they hear and make sensible judgments about the road worth taking. Thank you.